Welcome to the CEC Report, the first for 2014. It's the 3rd of January. I'm Robert Barwick, and once again I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, hockey knows 3 economic threats coming in 2014. The CEC knows the solution. New Eurasian Union, the end of the old imperial system, and the bubble is stretching when banks lend more to property investors than to home buyers. So first, hockey knows 3 economic threats coming in 2014. The CEC knows the solution. Craig, in the final sitting of Parliament in December, which I was present at as part of being up there with our ad in the 3 December Australian newspaper against bail-in and warning about that, I was present in question time when Joe Hockey made a big deal of announcing that there were 3 economic threats that loomed globally in 2014, this year.
They're the ones he's talking about, Robbie, not the real ones.
Well, not all the real ones. These are real in their own way because we'll talk about them. So the first he declared was tapering of quantitative easing. The second one was stress tests that are coming up for the European banks. And the third one, and the big one really, is the US debt ceiling negotiations. So tapering. We've had years now of quantitative easing, and we're going to put a graph up. I've got it here, but we'll put it in colour on the screen. And what this graph shows is since 2008, the amount of money printing by the United States Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank, right? And this money printing is called quantitative easing, and they lend the money to the banks at virtually no interest. And it's this money that shored up the banks. And for the latter period from the Fed, it's been at the rate of $80 billion per month, right?
Sometimes higher. I've heard up to 110 billion for a month or two here.
Yeah, when they've had they've had this sort of standard, but they've tweaked it a little bit. Anyway, so as his last act in December, Ben Bernanke actually announced that tapering was coming into effect. And all that means is they're going to slowly reduce the amount of this money printing down by 10 billion to 70 billion a month, right? So it's still a lot of money. But what this graph shows though, Craig, is that despite all this money printing being funneled into the banks, total lending by the banks in those economies that are the recipients of this money has actually gone down in the same period. In other words, the banks are hoarding this money, right? Now, for most of 2013, when they talked about tapering, anytime it was mentioned, there was a bit of panic in the markets, and they kept talking about it. When they actually announced this in December, there wasn't as much panic. And this graph explains why, because of course, it's actually tapering, the quantitative easing is actually not having an effect in the real world, right? It's just shoring up bank balance sheets. It's not being lent out into the economy. And we've got other graphs that we've put on this show a few weeks ago that show things like the youth unemployment in the United States and these types of metrics, which prove that when the Fed says, oh, we can do this now because the economy's improved, no, it hasn't improved. So the real economy had nothing to panic about because they weren't the beneficiaries of this anyway, right? So anyway, that's now in place. Tapering has started, so we'll see what happens. The second one is these European stress tests. Now this is fascinating because the technocrats who run the European monetary system, and that's what they are, they're technocrats, they don't live in the real world, they've got this idea that they want to shut down more European banks. And they intend to do this by running these stress tests. And one of these guys, Andrea Enria, the head of the European Banking Authority, said to the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in November that it was unfortunate in Europe that only 40 banks closed in the wake of the 2008 crisis compared to the 500 that closed in the United States. He said, quote, governments wanted to keep their banks alive and that has hampered the healing process. So what they're going to do is run these stress tests on the banks. They're going to display the vulnerabilities of their balance sheets to the markets, etc. And they think that this will help them consolidate a new, highly concentrated financial system, right? Of course, there's going to be a lot of losers out of that process, and more sensible people are worried that this might trigger a whole new round of global financial crisis. And then finally is the debt ceiling. Now, the next 17th of October was the last debt ceiling deadline. That was like dodging a bullet, right? The next deadline is the 15th of January. So that's, 12 days away as we speak, right?
Yeah.
So we don't know what will happen yet. We don't know that, there's been a little, because Christmas is in the winter over there, they only take a little bit of a break for the week or whatever. So Congress will be back next week, and these negotiations will start in earnest. There was a lot of bad blood last time. Craig, the other thing is Obama, the president, has very little moral authority in the United States anymore, and he doesn't deserve any either. So he can't really lay down the law and demand this type of debt ceiling raise. So we'll see what happens. We don't know what will happen. Anyway, these are things, Craig, that Joe Hockey highlighted. Now his answer, as with, and not his own, but his answer is austerity. Paul Keating and Bob Hawke were quoted in the January 1st newspaper saying, encouraging the government to cut hard. Now this has consequences. The $5 Medicare co-payment is an example. Now that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but the point of that is the definition of austerity, because it's to send the message to people, don't use the hospitals, the health system, right? Suck it up, be brave. Well, you can go, we won't go through all that, but people can see there's an intention there. But we in the CEC have a clear perspective on all this. Right? Now, Craig, we spent all last year talking about it, but it's the start of a new year. So why don't you lay out to the viewers precisely the CEC's program that can address all this?
Well, first of all, Robbie, we have to go with Glass-Steagall. And we've heard now that there's now 4 bills being presented to the House of Representatives in the United States. The last one was after the Volcker rules, which were these sort of tweaking rules that were introduced into the House last December last. Immediately that was done, another bill was introduced saying we need Glass-Steagall.
Because the Volcker rules are designed to pretend that the government in the US is cutting down on banking speculation. But any type of specific regulation like that always gives the bank scope to get around it, right? And that's when, sensible people in the Congress said, no, Glass-Steagall or nothing.
What we've had since the beginning of quantitative easing, Robbie, is the pumping of a bubble up at $4 trillion, maybe more, we don't really know, into the financial side of the monetary system. Yep. This has inflated the stock market. It's created a huge bubble, a huge debt bubble in most cases, and that this money is lent out cheap interest rates and so forth to the other banks. People
should compare those stock market figures at the moment from America, which is at record highs, with the youth unemployment figures we just showed.
Right, yeah, and the point is that the solution is Glass-Steagall. We've got to go back to a regulated banking system whereby you have, you put the entire financial speculative side of the merchant banking, investment banking system into a quarantine, and you protect the commercial banking system. That's what Glass-Steagall does, and that's why there's such a howl from the likes of Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan and Stanley, in order to be able to not have this, right? So that's the first thing. Then you've got to go with a national bank for large creation of credit for large infrastructure development projects. Now specifically what we've said...
new money like quantitative easing but for productive purposes.
Put it into the productive side of the economy. It won't be inflationary, Robbie. If you are increasing the physical output capacity of output capacity of your nation. Now this is where it comes to the medical thing, right? We believe that there should be free universal healthcare. How do you fund that? Well, you have to go back to the idea of King O'Malley's Commonwealth Bank. Use the Commonwealth Bank to fund the capital development of the hospitals. Don't put that into operating budgets of the hospitals. Get away from this privatisation of the medical system where you have companies literally making profits out of the sickness of people. Now this should never have been allowed to have been part of...
As an aside, Craig, the single most profitable Australian company in the last 25 years is the old Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, the government medical research that was privatised, the first thing Keating privatised, and in the last 25 years it's returned a 25% return to its private investors as a profitable enterprise. If it's that profitable, why did we sell it?
Well, this is where infrastructure plays a crucial role. We know people are going to get sick. We're not immortal. Therefore, we're going to require medical care. Therefore, if you allow this vulnerability to fall into private hands, as it has, then you become subject to the private profits of the system. And that's what's happened now. So consequently, unless you've got a lot of money and you can afford private healthcare, you're basically given a number, say stand in line and we'll get to you when we can. Now this is what this $5 Medicare bulk billing's about. It's beginning the process of bringing in austerity. $5 to those who are on $100,000 a year is nothing. But to someone who's on a pension is a huge amount, relatively speaking. So what you do is you fund large-scale infrastructure development, particularly health, the building of hospitals, through a national bank credit issue, and then you fund the actual operational aspect of the hospitals through the normal budget process. So you take out the
Really
cost,
expensive stuff.
the really expensive stuff, the long-term stuff, out of the equation, and you take out private profiteering. Right, and this is the principle of national banking. It's the principle of developing an economy. But to start with, you have to have Glass-Steagall. You can't allow this speculative, this gross speculative bubble, debt bubble, literally draining the lifeblood out of the economy. It's a bit like a flea on a dog, Robbie, where the flea gets bigger and bigger and bigger till eventually the dog dies.
Because the flea's bigger than the dog.
And what happens to the flea? If it's the only dog in the world, the flea dies as well. And that's the nature of a speculative, parasitical economy that we've got. So it's either Glass-Steagall this year, or the entire financial system will disintegrate and fall in a heap.
Yep. All right, thanks very much, Craig. That was a very good summary. When we come back, we're going to talk about the political side of where the world's heading in the next 12 months, which very much ties into what you just said. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Now to global politics. The new Eurasian Union, the end of the old imperial system. Now, Craig, viewers might have noticed there's been a bit of rioting in the country of Ukraine. And it's one of those issues that, you know, you get it in your sound grab or your vision grab on the nightly news wrap-up of world events and whatever. And big protest in Ukraine, and of course to the ignorant Australian viewer, it's like, oh, the Ukrainian people hate their president. They all want to join the European Union, and he won't let them. And then I wonder how many people stop to think, well, hang on, what's so good about the European Union nowadays? Why would all those people in Ukraine want to join it? Well, it turns out all the reporting that we're getting about what this thing in Ukraine is a pack of lies. Because here's the bottom line. The current president of the Ukraine has pulled the rug on an Anglo-American agenda. And what the Anglo-Americans did, as soon as the Soviet Union fell, they knew that, you know, the communist regime was gone, but there was still Russia as an entity, and their imperial mindset kicked in. Malcolm Fraser spoke about this a few years ago, where, you know, when the Cold War ended, NATO acted as if it was still ongoing, right? And what they set out to do was encircle Russia by picking off the countries that straddled its borders. Right? Now, Ukraine was their big prize because it's a very, very big country sitting right beside Russia. And there was an idiotic president in the Ukraine and one in Georgia and whatever, and they tried to lure them into membership of the European Union and of NATO. Now, here's NATO, Russia's bitter enemy for 50 years, and they expected Russia to tolerate a country on its border being a member of NATO, right? Sensible people said, hang on, you know, America wouldn't tolerate that, for example, if it was Mexico. And I'll give you a historical precedent. After World War II, there was the country of Poland was the biggest sticking point between the West and Russia, because the Russian leadership said, we will not accept a regime in Poland that's not pro-Russian, pro-Soviet. Now, to all the Cold War warriors, they thought, they're the commies, no, we've got to crush the commies, etc. Henry Stimson was the US Secretary of War under Roosevelt. He said to Truman, he made the analogy, he said, the Russians view Poland the way we would view Mexico, and if we wouldn't tolerate a hostile regime to us in Mexico, we can't expect Russia to tolerate a hostile regime in Poland, right? Well, if that was Poland, Ukraine's even closer to Russia. That's the point. So what he's done is, the president of Ukraine knows there is no future for Ukraine in the European Union. The whole thing's falling apart. It's in economic ruin. Why would they want to join that thing, right? And what he wants to do is go off in another direction. What you're seeing with these protests, they're not the people of Ukraine. They're a fifth column kind of thing that Western intelligence agencies are setting up to try and, you know, subvert the Ukrainian government. But let's see what really happened. On Christmas Eve, there was a meeting in Moscow, and it was of the Eurasian Supreme Economic Council, and that included Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, and the Ukrainian president was there as an observer. Now, we'll put a map up on the screen, and a coloured map, and people can see, for example, the relative size, territorial size of these economies. They are huge, right? In his opening remarks at that Eurasian meeting, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Eurasian integration, quote, creates conditions for the dynamic development of our countries, noting that despite adverse global economic conditions, the common market of the three member states is expanding, with trade among the custom union countries, that is the first three, Belarus, Kazakhstan and Russia, expanding threefold between 2010 and 2012. Putin said that, quote, the share of raw materials in export-import operations is going down. I would like to stress that this is a very important part of our joint work. We are reducing mutual trade in raw materials and increasing trade in high-tech goods. This is the opposite of the direction of the economies of the transatlantic countries, right? Yep. The United States and the European Union. And of course, as part of this Eurasian integration, China is participating and it's doing separate deals with all these countries to build its Eurasian land bridge idea, the new Silk Road, high-speed trains and those types of things. Craig, Lyndon LaRouche has called this development the end of the old imperial system. The problem is the British imperialists won't accept this willingly, will they?
No, Rob, because as Lyndon LaRouche said in his piece, which is called LaRouche, it's the end of the old imperial system, which people should read on the LPAC website, he makes it very clear. The issue here is national sovereignty. So what Putin is expressing is what you do if you're a sovereign nation. He said, he's not saying like the imperialists saying, here's this bed, this limited economic bed like the European Union, you come and jump into bed with us. He's not saying that, he's saying, come here, join this, what they call a customs union, which is what you went through, yep. And we'll expand your economy. We'll create your own bed and we'll grow your bed larger. Now see, the Ukrainians have had a look at the European Union's bed and they said there's no room in this for us. We're going to have Greece and Spain and all these countries that are collapsing under austerity. This is not where we want to be, right? So in a sense, they did pull the rug out of the bed and they said, oh, we're going to go and join this other expanding bed idea of Russia because there's the principle of national sovereignty being expressed here. Now this principle of national sovereignty is something that Putin and China represent. They understand that the role of the nation state is to support its citizens. And they're saying, we're going to use our size, our capability, our history to create a customs union that other countries can join on the basis of national sovereignty.
So Craig, though, something has since happened in Russia, which is these two bombs going off in Volgograd, huge threats to the Sochi Winter Olympics. That when we get the reporting of that, there's no context for that, but isn't this the context for that?
Look, they've got to try and discredit Putin no matter how they can. And look, they're going to use the Snowden affair to try and do that. And what is Snowden saying? He's basically saying the British are hell-bent on creating a society where there is no such thing as privacy anymore. He said that in direct response to the Queen's message this last Christmas period. So what you have is this battle between those that stand for national sovereignty, like the Chinese and particularly Russian, who's Putin, who's a figurehead within Russia, against this British imperial system. And this is something that most people just don't even consider as part, because they're usually too busy doing all sorts of other things. And this loss of privacy is a huge deal, because as Snowden says, if you have children growing up without the idea of privacy, then you basically got a police state. You've got informers and you've got people who will not understand what that means to have the space to be the creative space, to the private space.
Yeah, and so Snowden represents kind of like the same strain in the United States that LaRouche is part of, which is these patriots who don't get covered in the media, but they're real Americans. There's a lot of them, and they're saying, no, we don't want to go to the brink with the British imperialists. Let's collaborate with the world. Let's get a step back from this kind of imperial idea.
Yeah, I think the role that General Dempsey's played in this war avoidance program in the last several years is crucial to highlight as well, because it represents that strain inside the United States that is opposing the British imperialist designs of Obama and others.
Yep. All right, we're running out of time on that. When we come back, we're going to talk about the property bubble in Australia, and believe me, it's one. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, The bubble is stretching when banks lend more to property investors than to home buyers. So, Craig, in the month of November that's just gone, for the first time in over 15 years, Australian banks lent more money to property investors than they did to home buyers. Now, it's just marginally more, 6.4 billion to investors compared to 6.2 billion to home buyers. But considering for most of the noughties, and we're now in 2013, most of this century, all the incentives have been geared to home buyers. You've had through the first home buyer grant arrangements and the way they were massively increased when crisis hit, etc. Right? But now they're not buying, and this is not a one-off for a month. This is when the two figures one went below the other, because for a long time it's been like this. The property investors have been increasing their share and the home buyers have been dropping, and now it's for November. That's what happened. What it means is that the home buyers are increasingly being priced out.
Well, Robbie, if you take home buyers, usually you're talking about home buyers are people that want to buy a home based upon their personal income.
Yep.
You have, look at what's happening in the manufacturing sector, look what's happening in the resources sector and so forth, right? There's no certainty there. What you have is an enormous pool of money, particularly with superannuation funds and so forth, and the push is to invest in property.
And they're allowed to borrow. The super funds are allowed to borrow to invest.
But the key here is the mortgage. That at the end of the day, there's a mortgage. It's either secured by the incomes from individual people or secured by the income from the property investors. Those mortgages then are securitised, Robbie, and they're traded. The income stream from those mortgages is traded. They're derivatised, and that's therein lies the key. We're not talking about people or banks being concerned about people getting into homes. We're talking about banks that are trying to secure themselves, or they're already pretty exposed to this property bubble. They've got to get more and more income to keep themselves afloat.
Yep, exactly. We call it a property bubble. We use that term. I've started to think of it, Craig, not so much a property bubble, but property is part of the derivatives bubble. And if you look at the illustrations on the screen of the icebergs of the bank's derivatives, that's the issue. Those banks have to shore that up, and they're running out of home buyers to lend to, right? So they've got to do it through to investors, because with investors it's easier for banks to justify the loan. They've got more collateral to lend against because they've got all these investment properties. But this analysis from the UBS, and the analyst's name is John Mott, shows that 57% of the landlords that are getting these loans their term is leverage, which means heavily in debt, right, already. And the vast majority of them, Craig, are low to middle income earners. In other words, these are people that bought the propaganda and said, I want to become a property investor. How many ads have we seen on TV? I'll become a property investor. So they've done it. And this guy, UBS analyst John Mott, said this posed a risk if unemployment rose, as it is projected to, and large amounts of investment property flood the market. The solution, again, is Glass-Steagall, right? Because the issue is not, you can't prop up this derivatives bubble. So we need to, Glass-Steagall will let the bubble burst without affecting the real economy.
Come back to what I said in the first segment of this program, Robbie. With health, people are going to get old.
Yep.
We're going to get old, we're going to need medical care. So if we have an area which should never be subject to private capital. People need to live in houses. They should never be subjected to having to pay to private investors for the sake of actually having a roof over their head. This is a known area, and it's not something that should be allowed for speculation.
Speculation, no, exactly, and that's the system. Anyway, this is something that it's a key little turning point that's happened. We will concentrate on it. So that's it for this first CEC report for 2014. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more of these developments.